Hi, good evening. This is Yaakov Katz from Senior Fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, and welcome to another daily briefing of the JPPI during this ongoing conflict between Israel and still Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and who knows what else is awaiting us. We are about 20 days and almost 3 weeks into the war, and there's a lot to talk about today with our panelists. Einat Wilf, a former member of Knesset, a former senior fellow at JPPI, and acclaimed author, as well as Gil Troy, current senior fellow at JPPI, acclaimed author, historian, and public speaker. But before we dive in to talk about today's topic, I had an interview earlier this afternoon with Elliot Abrams, who's the chairman of the Tikva Fund and a former deputy national security advisor under the George W. Bush administration, and under Donald Trump served as the coordinator for the Iran. So was very much involved in Iranian policy. And we spoke for about 10, 12 minutes about what is the posturing of the United States right now in the Persian Gulf? What does it all mean? And what should we expect in terms of a potential showdown with Iran? Elliot brings a very interesting perspective, which we'll then ask our panelists to respond to. So here is Elliot Abrams. Elliot, it's great to have you with us at JPPI. You're also a member of the board, so we thank you for being with us. Everyone's kind of very hyper-focused on what's happening in Gaza. When are the troops going to go in? What's the ground invasion going to look like? What will the resistance that the idea of troops will come up against? Obviously, a very important topic, but there is a bigger issue that is out there, and that is the Iranian threat that continues to be presented to Israel and Iran's role in all of this. And I'm wondering, do you feel, which I kind of feel, is that we're focused too much on the tentacles and on the proxies, while the Iranians are getting away with immunity?
Yes, I think this is the weak point in U.S. policy and the Biden administration's policy. The president's been loath to speak about Iran. He did say at one point, more generally, don't. Remember the famous don't.
Right.
And Secretary Blinken also said, we'll respond if we're attacked. Well, we've been attacked, we, the United States.
Yes.
13 separate attacks. The administration apparently is rushing air defense to the region to defend Americans better. That's fine, but it's inadequate. What the administration needs to make clear to Iran is that we're going to respond directly against Iran for attacks on Americans. Otherwise, we're just going to have more and more attacks, and Iran will view the United States as unwilling to engage, as willing to accept almost any amount of punishment without going after the sources of the punishment. The source is Tehran. So I think this is a real problem in American policy, dealing with Shia militias in Iraq, for example, is not going to protect Americans in the end.
When I speak to some Americans about this, they say, but Yaakov, there's no direct evidence that shows that Iran was involved in the October 7th attacks against Israel. And my argument is, we don't know that they've been funding them. We don't know that they've been behind Hamas all these years. I mean, what do you make of that? I'm sure you're hearing that too from people.
I am, and I think it's a ridiculous argument, and I think it is an effort to get away from having a confrontation with Iran. I understand the desire to avoid the confrontation, but it's a very bad mistake, because Iran will keep escalating as long as they think they can get away with it. We know everything we need to know about Iran's relationship with Shia militias in Iraq that are attacking Americans, the relationship with Hezbollah, the relationship with Hamas and Islamic Jihad. It doesn't matter from the American point of view whether Iranians were involved in the October 7th attack directly. What matters is that in all of those countries, it is Iran that is enabling these groups to attack Israel and to attack Americans, to attack the United States. And again, except for the killing of Soleimani, they have been killing Americans since the 1980s, and we have basically done nothing about it. And that's a dangerous mistake.
I think as we speak, even Iran's foreign minister is in New York City, right? And America could potentially deny him a visa, although because he's going to the UN. But that they didn't even decide to do. The issue of Iran also, I'm wondering, do you think that at the end of the day, I mean, it's difficult to know, but do you think that they're really orchestrating all of this, right? In other words, there are people who fear that Iran wants the distraction of Hamas, wants the potential distraction of Hezbollah, wants to deplete Israeli defenses, and then maybe even use this as an opportunity to break out to a nuclear weapon.
Basically, I think that's right. That is, I think that Iran has, for the last certainly decade, run an extremely successful foreign policy. They got the 2015 nuclear deal, which allowed them to enrich and which had sunsets in it that are already happening. They have much more oil revenue now than they had years ago. They're spending maybe $1 billion a year, maybe more, on all of these proxies. What is the goal of this policy? The goal is to dominate the Middle East, slowly but surely to push the United States back and to eliminate the only countervailing force in the region beyond the US, which is the state of Israel. So I think, yeah, this is Iranian foreign policy. Mm-hmm. This is not a secret. This is not something we need studies to discover.
Right.
We know what they're trying to do. And there are basically, because the Arabs are too weak, there are basically two forces that can possibly stop it. And it's Israel and the United States. For the moment, the United States is not doing it. That's the problem with our policy.
Right. I mean, you mentioned this before, but even Biden it has difficulty for some reason saying that four-letter word, Iran, in all his wonderful, amazing, heartwarming speeches for the Israelis, but he steers clear of saying Iran. I'm curious, Elliot. On the other hand, while they're not doing maybe enough, they're moving a lot of assets into the region, right? The Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group is already in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Eisenhower is on its way to the Persian Gulf. They're somewhere, I think, crossing the Atlantic as we speak. That's a serious amount of firepower and vessels that they're going to be parking, not just in the Med, but also off the coast of Iran. And if war were to escalate between Israel and Hezbollah, what are you practically see that force being used to do? What are they really going to be there for?
Yeah, that's a great question. No one knows the answer to that. I mean, maybe the president does, but the fact that no one knows the answer is not necessarily a bad thing, because we want Iran and Hezbollah worrying about what it might be used for. Would it be used, for example, in case of an Israel-Hezbollah war to help Israel with air defense? That's one question. Right. If Israel got in real trouble in a two-front war, would it conceivably be used to attack sites that are sending missiles into Israel? The military buildup is a very, very good thing for which we should thank President Biden. What's missing, though, is any sense that he would use it against Iran. I mean, the question is really partly what he's saying publicly and partly what he's saying privately. Toward the end of the Trump administration, what we said mostly privately to Iran was, if you kill an American, we're going to attack you. We're going to hit you, not some proxy in Western Iraq, you. And the result was a significant reduction in attacks in Iraq and in Syria. I don't know what the administration is saying privately, just right. Saying don't. Then when it's followed by 13 attacks on Americans, obviously it's not a sufficient deterrent. So I think in fact, we should act. The problem with saying if you kill an American is that it kind of says, as long as you stop below that, all you do is injure Americans, then you're safe. So that doesn't really work either.
Yeah, I've been watching the American news, and they talk about, well, there were some injured. There was one guy who died of a heart attack, a contractor. Right. You start to get into like the Rashi of what exactly is somebody being killed by Iranian militias. But I also wonder, what I've been thinking a lot about is, so Biden sends these forces. He doesn't mention Iran. It's almost like he doesn't want to fall into the trap that Obama fell into with the red lines back in 2013 with Syria. So he's not putting it out clearly. On the other hand, with that amount of force and with that amount of firepower, and something big does happen, he's setting himself up to have to do something, right?
That's probably right. I mean, I agree with you on the red line. And as I said, the fact that we don't know exactly what he will do, that's okay too. My problem is that Iran is acting. It is
already
trying to kill Americans. It is injuring Americans already in the last few days. And there's no American reaction. I think that's likely. If the president's trying to avoid a military confrontation, which he is, then you can't just let Iran build and build and build until the point where you have to respond. I don't think that's a wise policy.
I want to ask you one last question. Israelis often look back in the whole debate about how to stop Iran's nuclear program. One of the examples that's often been touted is what happened in 2003. You were then in the administration under George W. And the buildup of American forces in that region ahead of the invasion of Iraq got the Iranians to be afraid that something might be happening. And they stopped enrichment, they stopped the military component and that track for their nuclear program. So what Israelis often say is we need a credible military threat on the table, right? And that can potentially do the job. Maybe this is an opportunity also for Biden, we know has been a big advocate of a return to the JCPOA since he came into office, but maybe this is an opportunity for Biden to actually lay down a line in the sand with the Iranians and say, this is not just about you trying to kill our people or Israelis. This is also about your nuclear program. That would up the ante a bit, but maybe this is an opportunity.
It isn't anything new for him. The president has said they will not get a nuclear weapon on my watch. And obviously he's got the forces in the region that would permit him to act on that. I think the Iranians are probably too smart to make a kind of race or rush for the bomb right now. That may be wishful thinking, but I think they are with these forces around. But again, to me, the critical question is, can they attack Americans with impunity? And the answer so far is yes, and that's dangerous.
Yeah. Elliot Abrams, thank you so much for joining us at JPPI. We appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
So, Einat, maybe we'll start with you. Turn your video back on to just get some impressions. Elliot, we see you.
Oh, good. Okay.
Elliot is taking a pretty, do I call it aggressive, more aggressive than what we're seeing right now from the administration. I think a lot of people are talking about the fact that America's already under attack, right? Iranian proxies are already attacking U.S. military positions in Iraq and Syria. And the U.S. so far is kind of biting its lip or tongue and not doing anything in response. Do you, thinking about what the Israeli policy might be on this, would Israel want to see a more active America right now than what we're already seeing in terms of the deployment and the rhetoric, actual American engagement?
Personally, I don't think so. That is an escalation level that I'm not sure Israelis have any interest in. But in any case, this is an American choice to make. You can talk to Elliot Abrams about it, but I'm Israeli. This is an American choice. America will decide how far it wants to go, how far it wants to consider this a casus belli and an attack that justifies direct American involvement. They're clearly mobilizing in a way that wants to convey deterrence so that hopefully it doesn't escalate. But at this point, Israel has a very immediate need to secure its borders. American choices are far beyond that.
American choices are far beyond that, Gil, but they definitely pertain also to what happens here, right? while it's one thing for the US to deploy forces in the region, whether it's in the Eastern Mediterranean or in the Persian Gulf, as an act maybe of deterrence. And as Elliot said, from what I hear, it seems to be correct. They haven't yet made the decision of what happens if, right? So, rock missiles are fired from Lebanon at Israel in a bigger way to Haifa or Tel Aviv. What does America do? Iran fires missiles. What does America do? Those are the cases and the scenarios that they'll have to decide in real time. But it also raises, I think, maybe a deeper question about Israel, which is always that we have always taken pride in that we fight by ourselves and without requiring anyone else, right? We defend ourselves by ourselves. And here, very quickly on this conflict, the prime minister called up the president, and that clearly something happened in that conversation that led the president to immediately dispatch the Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group. So is that changing that ethos a bit?
The IRS has determined that even though I am an Israeli citizen, I still have to pay taxes in the United States of America, and I have the right to vote. So unlike or not, I can speak both in an American voice and an Israeli voice. Let me start with the American voice and then get to the essence of your question with the Israeli voice. The American voice echoes what Elliot Abrams say. To me, it is outrageous, and deeply un-American that there have been 13 attacks. The fact that they were only injured is I take no solace in that. And it goes back to the essence of your question also to him, which is, why is there this unwillingness on the part of the United States of America right now to use that four-letter word, Iran? And I think a lot of it, I've been fascinated by this because, we, as historians, we always sort of see that there are some enemies we love to hate, right? Like at a certain point after Pearl Harbor, Americans loved hating the Japanese and loved hating the Nazis, but it took them a while. During the Cold War, Americans loved to hate the Soviets. And we, and especially Democrats, don't love to hate Iranians. And certainly the issue isn't with Iranians, it's with the Iranian regime. But again and again, the Iranian regime is getting a pass. I think a lot of it goes back to Barack Obama's campaign against Hillary Clinton in 2007, 2008 for the nomination, trying to say, hey, wait a minute, we're not going to be about war, we're going to be about jaw. I was against the Iraq war, and we're going to try to negotiate with the mullahs. And that became a point of pride, and that led to the JCPOA. And I think Biden has kind of adopted that, and it's become a kind of democratic tenet of, look how much more enlightened we are. We're not like those goonish Republicans. But I think that when you're attacked, you have to respond. And there's another easy way to do this without escalating it, because I share in us worry about escalation. It's called economic sanctions. We need to cut off the spigot of Iranian oil. Now, I know it's complicated because of what's going on with Russia, but we need to start saying that and understanding that the billions of dollars being pumped into the Iranian economy end up leading to Israeli deaths and deaths of all kinds of other people. So my American in me wants a more affirmative, clear stance by the president of the United States. Just as he's embraced Israel, he has to put much more pressure on Iran. The Israeli within me says, yes, I agree with you that it's very important that Israel take care of itself, but it never hurts to have friends in the region. And it never hurts to have those. I mean, I have to say, I was deeply moved in all my identities. I'll even add the Canadian part of me. I've paid taxes in all three constituents, so I can say we whenever it's convenient. To see the Gerald R. Ford making its way toward Israel was a very powerful moment. And Teddy Roosevelt said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." If Biden is doing that, if behind the scenes the message is going to the Iranians, slow down, look, we're here, and he's not doing the rhetoric, that's okay with me. But I worry about this blind spot. And I think both an Israeli and as an American, we need to see more clear American threats against Iran economically, and against Iran diplomatically, and against Iran militarily.
So just to our viewers, you obviously have the Q&A box. You can throw in some questions there. We already have a couple. You mentioned watching the Gerald R. Ford make its way here. So I don't know if everyone's into this genre, but there are websites that can actually track U.S. naval ships. So before getting on this Zoom, I went to get an update on where the Eisenhower is. It's still making its way across the Atlantic. It has yet to arrive. It was in Norfolk, and a couple of days ago it departed. So it's making its way. And I think to an extent that part of what's happening here is Israel waiting to see what assets America does put in place before making whatever move it's going to make in Gaza? Because it seems, Einat, from what I'm hearing, and I'm curious what your take is on this as well, is that the assumption is that once Israel does go into Gaza, something more will happen in the north. And maybe already there's a question of, is there even a point at this stage in doing something in the south, which is a problem and a threat and challenge, and definitely those people all need to be killed or captured, and Hamas needs to be destroyed to the extent possible. But the bigger challenge is the north. And if we have already thousands of refugees, everyone talks also, this is an interesting thing. In Israel, you notice in the media, they talk about the Akurim, right? With an I in for our viewers.
Internally displaced, yes.
Internally displaced, or people who have been uprooted almost from their homes. These are, but the people in Gaza who had to move from the north is our plitim, our refugees, right?
They're also internally displaced, of course.
Okay. But I would appreciate language that's used across the board, right? In other words, at least media should be consistent. So these are for all purposes internally displaced or refugees of Israelis, but the thousands in the north, they're not going to go back home if this is still the situation after this war, because Hezbollah will do what Hamas did in 4 months, 5 months, a year, 2, 3. Do you think that we're at this stage that maybe this is inevitable with Hezbollah?
I never assume that things are inevitable and there's room for agency, but there's no doubt that the assessment of the threat has changed massively. So if before that people thought, okay, we can live, we knew that Hamas was building, we knew that Hezbollah was building, but I think there was a sense that this was perhaps Iran encircling Israel for the purpose of deterrence in order to deter an Israeli attack on Iran. And there was a sense of almost this can be a kind of Cold War, maybe not mutually assured destruction, but painful destruction to each side, that neither side will take any major action. Iran will not use Hezbollah or Hamas, and Israel will not attack Iran. And I think this was an idea that people felt that Israel could live with, a kind of Cold War scenario whereby sometimes there's an operation here and there, but by and large, it's a semi-stable situation. What Hamas did basically destroyed the whole notion that you can maintain it as a stable situation. The entire assessment of what the threat is from the north now has changed. The insane scenarios that we've heard over the years now become very, very, very realistic. So now, of course, there's a notion that can an Israeli government afford to let that threat just be there and make claims about deterrence? Because Israelis are just not likely anymore to believe notions that say, oh, they are deterred or they are deterred. And there's no question that this raises the stakes of this moment.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, the one of the things that I find troubling, just I'm sure like all people around the world, depending where you are, who care about Israel and what's happening, are watching a lot of media and television. Obviously here, we're watching probably more of the Israeli channels, but we're listening to the same people, right? The same former heads of military intelligence, and the same former heads of the Shabak, and the same former defense ministers who were the fathers, because they're all men, no offense to the women, who are the fathers of this total failed misconception that, everyone who has asked me over the last almost now 3 weeks, how did this happen? So we could talk about the tactical level, right? The intelligence failure, the defensive measures that failed and collapsed, the failure of the IDF to rapidly deploy to stop the insurgents and the terrorists from entering. But what we're not talking about is how, when you have a myth that you believe in at the top, everything you see will be read according to the narrative that you're telling yourself. So when you see them coming to the border, no, it's not, they're not planning an invasion because it fits with this narrative. And when you see them practicing crawling in the sand and invading a mock IDF outpost, no, that's not what they're doing. They're just, playing a game. So I think that has been shattered. And you're so right that this concept today of deterrence needs to be completely rethought, because deterrence as its own, in my view at least, is not going to suffice. What we will need in the aftermath of whatever war this turns out to be is a policy also to an extent of preemptive action. We will never be able to allow them to rebuild. And while it's sad to say that, because what it does mean is it sentences Israel to an extent to a constant cycle of conflict, because we will constantly have to be attacking these enemies as they try to amass weapons and rearm and train for additional attacks, because we're not going to be able to eradicate them like the politicians like to claim. And that's an unfortunate reality. But on the other hand, I don't see an alternative at the moment. So Gil, though, going back to Iran for a moment, Biden on the political side of things, is a war bad for Biden? A direct military confrontation? We're a year now, pretty much a year and a week away, or 2 weeks away from the next election. And when he's still running for re-election, that seems to be the case. Although Gavin Newsom was in China the other day, well, what was he doing there? I don't fully understand. But what is the direct military confrontation? What would that mean for Biden politically?
First, the Trump people would say he's getting his instructions from his handlers, but we'll talk about that in group therapy later. Look, you're absolutely right. This has to be seen also through a presidential lens and through the timetable of 2024. Look at the scenario that Donald Trump has. He can say, Joe Biden came in, Afghanistan, debacle, Ukraine, stalemate, Israel, degraded. And that is why, while I don't think Joe Biden wants a war, because part of the reason why you had the Afghanistan debacle, which by the way started with Trump, but we'll put that aside because that's only truth and we don't really care about truth these days, we've been told, was that there is a kind of exhaustion in America. The language of forever wars was really one of the big problems with Afghanistan, when in fact there was a very small force that was keeping 40 million people safe from the Taliban and unspeakable barbarism. But there was kind of this whole conception, right, if we can use the Israeli notion, a conception that had to change. I don't think, especially given his age, to be frank, that it's helpful for Joe Biden to go into an election campaign looking weak. And that's why everybody worried about the bear hug, that somehow Joe Biden is constraining Israel. I think Israel is also, this is more like a long hug. Joe Biden is very implicated by what happens in Israel. Israel needs a big victory. And I like the fact that the way you put it wasn't the way some of our political leaders are saying, we're going to crush Hamas. They're going to say, we're going to crush Hamas to the extent that we can to make it a more livable situation, right? That's much more of a realistic aim. And we have to be very careful not to escalate the rhetoric, especially on the part of our leaders. But I think Israel needs to have a victory parade. And I think that victory parade also has to have some singing of the Star Spangled Banner for Biden's sake and for the sake of the world. America can't afford another big mess right now, and Biden certainly can't afford it.
Well, that mess is here, front and center, unfortunately, at the moment for Israel. I want to, before we wrap up, I want to get both of your takes on really the big question that everybody talks about every single day and every hour of the day. Where is the ground offensive? Why is it delayed? Why is it not happening? And kind of how I've mapped things out, in my impression, is we're looking at three different scenarios. One is what seems to be the case, and Biden said this yesterday. Yes, I've asked the prime minister to delay, to try to allow for time for hostage negotiations. Number two is we know that Netanyahu has always been hesitant. It's in his DNA to put boots on the ground. The one time that he did it was 2014 during what was known as Protective Edge. And the reason he did it then was only after massive pressure from Naftali Bennett in the cabinet, and after Hamas terrorists started to pop out of tunnels and were starting to kill our soldiers, did he feel he had no choice but to go in. And that conflict, remember, lasted 51 days, I think, or at least 50 days. And that's option 2. And option 3 is that really what's happening is kind of what we were just discussing before, is more Gaza is important, but that's not the bigger problem. We actually have to get ready for the war in the north. So we're actually maybe shifting gears, and we don't necessarily see it publicly yet, but maybe that's what's happening behind the scenes. I'm curious on and then, sorry, there's the bigger issue. There was just a press conference now with the families of the hostages saying to the prime minister, don't forget us, don't you dare. There was Eyal Berkovich, who is a legendary soccer player in Israel and now has his own TV show, but he was protesting outside the Kiryat military headquarters earlier today, started yelling at the prime minister, don't you dare go into, yelling on the street. Obviously, Bibi wasn't there, but don't you dare go into Gaza. The hostages come first. And I think that there is this debate right now that's going on here of what does come first. Is it the hostages, or is it the safety and security of Israel's borders and the defeat of these terrible, monstrous enemies that we're facing? A tough question to get a quick answer to, but I'd love for both of your thoughts. Einat, let's start with you.
First, a ground invasion is a means, not an end. So personally, I don't understand all the people who are asking about it. It's a means. The question is it the best way to achieve the ends? And this is where I go to the hostages. The bigger question is that still, it's not really clear what are the ends, what are the very specific, defined, serious goals of this campaign, of this war. And that is what we're not getting from our leaders, setting out the priorities, saying what they're going to focus on. And I will just say something. We used to be a country that could do both, defend our borders and save hostages from wherever they are. The fact that we are now looking at it as a zero-sum situation, I think has a lot to do with a long degradation of the way that Israel thinks about its security. And I think that also goes to what you said earlier. An Israel that made preemptive strikes, 1956, 67, the change in April 1948, was an Israel that I think had a better understanding of defense and security than an Israel that hunkers down.
Gil?
I agree with Einat that it's a mistake to always be on their timetable and be waiting for them to strike. I'm going to quote, I'm a very nice guy, I'm liberal, I'm enlightened, I'm an academic. I'm going to quote one of my liberal cousins who says that Israel only survives not through a balance of power, but through a balance of terror. And we lost the balance of terror on October 7th. And we have to kind of restore that. And it's not nice and it's not elegant, but somehow or other, that I think is the fundamental goal of this war. And I'm with Einat, I don't care ground game, air game. For me, with kids on all the different borders, every day that the bombing campaign continues and softens the targets and continues to be constructive in a destructive sort of way, is one less day that we don't have to worry about going to more funerals. Yeah. So I know that democracies do better when we're patient, when we're focused, and yes, when we unleash unbelievable power when necessary, but only when necessary and only in a way that's thoughtful, and will make sure that we win.
Thank you both. Thank you, Einat, and thank you, Gil, and thanks everyone for joining this JPPI session and this webinar. We'll be back. We're taking a break for the weekend. We'll be back on Sunday, and let's hope for a quiet Shabbat. Shabbat shalom to everyone.